Homework 1 has to do with factoring. Now, those of you that are not good at factoring, you really need to practice this section because we will use it all semester long. Okay, so first thing you're going to do is when you're looking at a problem is see if you can factor out a greatest common factor. In this case, we're looking at 36, 12, and 6. 6 will go into all of them, okay? But because this first term is negative, we're first going to factor out a negative 6 with our numbers. Now we're going to look at our x's. We have 4 of them here, 2 here, and 1 here. They all have at least 1 in common. With our y's, same thing. They have at least 1. You always want to pick the one with the smallest exponent. Okay, so then what you said, well, 6 goes into 36 6 times. That's going to be positive because a negative 36 divided by negative 6 gives us positive. You're going to say x to the fourth divided by x to the first. It's going to give us x cubed. And then y cubed divided by y gives us y squared. So what I'm doing is just subtracting my exponents. Then this, when I factor out a negative 6xy, I'm going to be left with a positive 2x. Our y's disappear. And then plus, now some people, the biggest mistake I see is they put 0. But negative 6xy divided by negative 6xy gives us 1. Remember, if you were to distribute this out, you have to end up with this, otherwise you factored it wrong. Okay, and then you would look to see if this can factor further later on, but right now it doesn't. Okay, in these 3 terms, these have 3. Terms are separated by plus or minus signs. Okay, this has a minus sign. So here's a term, this one's a term, and so is this. They all have an x plus 2 in common. So I'm going to factor that out. By factoring that out, I'm really dividing each term by it. So here, I'm going to have an x squared. Here, I'm going to have minus x. And here, minus 9. And then again, later on, we would look to see if this factors further, but it won't. Well, not later on. You always look to see if it factors further, but it doesn't at this point. Okay, factor by grouping. You use the grouping method when there are 4 terms. So what you're going to do is you're going to group the first 2 and the second 2. Same thing here, 4 terms. The first 2 and the second 2. Okay, right here, I'm going to first act like, let me get something to cover that up. I'm first going to look at just this here, okay? And I can factor out, my greatest common factor would be a 3a squared. Again, the 6 and the 21 both have a 3 in common. That's the largest, the greatest common factor between 6 and 21. And then this has 3 a's, this has 2, so you always pick the one with the smaller exponent, so it's going to be a squared. Now you're left with 2a minus 7. And actually, I'm going to put that in a different color. (2a minus 7). Now I look at this right here. And because this is a plus, I don't really worry too much about it, but this is because I don't have to factor. When it's negative, you always factor out a negative. But right here, they both have a 2 in common, so I'm going to factor out, it's going to be plus 2. And when I do that, I'm left with 2a minus 7. Again, if I distributed this out, I get that. Okay. Now, looking at these 2 terms, they both have a 2a minus 7, let's see if I can get that clearer, in common. So that is our greatest common factor. Now, if I factor out a 2a minus 7 out of this term, I'm left with 3a. And if I factor out a 2a minus 7, I'm left with a plus 2. Remember, there's always multiplication. When you are factoring, it's multiplication between the two things, or however many factors there are. And then we're finished. Right here, you're going to factor out an a squared. And when I do that, I'm left with a minus 4. Right here, because this is negative, they both have a 3 in common, but I'm going to factor out a negative 3 when the leading coefficient is a negative. And I'm left with a minus 4, because a negative times a negative is a positive 12. Okay, now, by the way, I forgot to mention this up here. If these two things do not match, if they don't match, you've done something wrong, or if you did everything right, then it didn't factor to begin with. Okay, so they both have an a minus 4 in common, so I'm going to pull that out. And I'm left with a squared minus 3. And again, the only thing you might as well start looking for is, will this factor further? Okay, it's an a squared. If this was a perfect square, it would be the difference of two squares. So it would factor further, but it's not, so you're done. Okay, the guess and check method. This is my favorite way, or this is how I factor, but then again, I have practiced, I don't know how many, I factor all the time with my job, so this is easy for me. So, the first terms, well, let me put this underneath here. The first terms, first of all, you look to see if it's, you can pull out a GCF, but you can't, okay? The only way to get these x squared is an x times x. That's the only way to get x squared, okay, is x times x. Now these last terms, so the first terms come from here. The last terms come from this number here, okay? That's what's going to go in this spot here. Because this is negative, one has to be a positive and one has to be a negative. All right, so you have 1 and 12, 2 and 6 gives us 12, and 3 and 4. And again, 1 is negative. So now I'm just going to plug things in. I will tell you right now, I already know the answer is going to be here, depending on where it's placed, which I even know that because I've practiced this so much. And you would too if you practice this all the time. But the reason it's called guess and check is you try something, then you check it with FOIL to get that middle term, and if it doesn't work, then you try something else or you guess something else. Now I'm going to do this wrong, okay? I'm going to put the 4 here and the 3 here. Now when I check using FOIL, okay, I shouldn't have to check the first and the last because the first came from here and the last things are going to give us negative 12. So the only thing I'm worried about is the OI part, the outsides plus insides. This gives me a negative 3x. This gives me a positive 4x. And that gives me a positive x, not a negative x. Because the sign is different, all I have to do is rather change these or just change the signs. I'm just going to change the signs. I'm going to make this a positive and I'm going to make this a negative. So now when I say x times 3, I get positive 3x, and then negative 4 times x is negative 4x, and that gives me a negative x. Now if you want, you can check the whole thing by doing first, outer, inner, last, or first, outsides, insides, last. But you'll find that you get this answer here. When you multiply, you should never miss these. You should know whether or not the answer is right before you hand in any problem, is if you check it using FOIL. Okay, right here, I notice that 2z, I can pull out a greatest common factor of 2z. And it needs to be negative because our leading coefficient is negative. This is going to give us a positive 2z squared plus 11z plus 15. Okay, so now when you go to do your, to factor further, you've got to bring this down. You cannot forget about it. If not, it'll end up just to be this, not this. Okay, now I'm just going to cover this up for now. It's just hanging out there. All right, these first terms come from here. This one right here, okay? The only way to get 2z is 2z and z. I'm just going to put them in there. You got to put them someplace. I don't care if you put z here and 2z there. I always just put my leading coefficient right here. Now, the last ones, these two here, come from this. It's going to be 1 and 15, or 3 and 5, or negative 1 and negative 15, and negative 3 and negative 5. I know the signs are going to be the same because that's the only way when multiplying it gives me a positive. So I'm going to look here. The only way to get a positive is if they're all positive. Okay. Now again, I know what the answer is, but I'm going to try that because what I always do is I always use the factors that are closest together. If this had not worked up here, I would have then gone here. Unless that middle number is really big, I rarely use this. If it's bigger or close to that number, then I will use those first terms. But I always call what I kind of use the middle terms, the ones that are close together. So I know the signs are both positive. But if you'd tried negatives and you found out that, it'd be the same thing as what we did up here, you just change them to negatives. Okay, so I'm going to guess 3 here and I'm going to guess 5 here. And I'm going to check it. So I get 10z plus 3z. That gives me 13z. That does not give me, okay, the 11z. Okay, so that's not going to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch the 5 and the 3 before trying the 1 and the 15. I'm going to use 5 here and I'm going to use 3 here. And now I'm going to check this answer. My outsides, 2z times 3 gives me 6z. My insides, 5 times z is 5z. That gives me 11z. So, and that's what we wanted right here. Now, this whole thing is my answer. The whole thing. You cannot forget about that because if you only had this only gives you this part here. In order to get this, you got to have that as well, or negative 2z. Okay, that's the guess and check. Not many students that I have use this. I do, but most of you will use AC method. Okay? Now, AC method, you're going to do, just like it says, A times C. Okay, so your A, this is in the form of A, I'm going to use AX squared plus BX plus C, even though this is using Y's. I don't really care about the variables. So you're going to say 8 times negative 6. And that's going to give us negative 48. Okay, so here's what you're going to do. You're just going to bring down this 8y squared. You're also going to bring down this negative 6. What you're going to do is replace this with two factors. Okay, so the next step, what you're going to do is you want to know the factors, which means multiply together. What numbers multiply together that give us negative 48 that add to give us positive 13. Okay, so my factors of negative 48. I know my signs have to be different. My larger one is going to be the positive. Okay, that's the only way I can get it because if I can use 1 and 40, oops, let's try negative 1 and a positive 48. That gives me 47, so I know that's not it. 2 will go into it. 24 times, and I get 22. 3 will go into it 16 times, and that gives me my positive 13. I don't need to find any other ones because that's what we found, okay? So these are the two that I'm going to use. So I get negative 3y plus 16y. Now if you switch these up, it will still work. You could have 8y squared plus 16y minus 3y minus 6, and it will still work, okay? Now we have, so what we did was we took this 13y out and we replaced it with this, because negative 3y plus 16y gives us 13y. Now we have 4 terms, factor by grouping. We've already learned this method. So I'm first going to, looking at this part right here, I'm going to pull out a y, and I'm left with 8y minus 3. Now, I don't know why I put that up there. I'm going to look what the common factor is here because this is positive. It's going to be a plus. They both have a 2 in common. And I have 8y minus 3. Notice that these two things match. Okay, that's what they're supposed to. So when I factor this out, they both have an 8y minus 3 in common. If I were to factor that out of here, I'm left with a y. If I factor that out of here, I'm left with a plus 2. I can't stress this enough. This is multiplication. I will see a lot of careless mistakes. People will put plus there. That won't work. These two, when multiplied together, will give you that. Now, those of you that had 1030 and those of you that had me for 1030, I taught a box method as well, which will work, okay? So we have to do the exact same thing as we did over here, okay? So what you do is you put a box like this, because I like this better than the AC method. I mean, it's kind of the same, but it's a little bit different. What we do is we take our first term, it always goes here. Our last term always goes there, okay? Those two things, first term's always upper left-hand corner, last term's always lower right-hand corner. Now, you still do the same thing here. And when we find this, we put negative 3y here, or 16y, it doesn't really matter, it'll work either way. So I'm going to put the 16y here. Now what you do is you take them columns and rows, and I'm going to do the rows first. What do they both have in common? They both have a y in common. Now I'm going to do the bottom row. What do both of these have in common? They both have a 2. Sorry, drawing a blank. Upper level math getting me. Then right here, I'm going to now do columns. What do they both have in common? And they both have an 8y in common. And then this column, they both have 8. Because this is negative, the top or the first terms, you're going to factor out a negative. Because this is a top one, is negative, we're going to factor out a negative 3. Now, here's one of them, 8 minus 3. And here's your other one, y, because that's positive, plus 2. Now it doesn't matter if you had y plus 2 or 8y minus 3. It doesn't matter. You can have either of these. It doesn't matter the order as long as they're multiplied and the factors are the same. It's the same thing as like saying 2 times 3 or 3 times 2. It doesn't really matter. They both give us 6. Either way, we ended up with the same answer. Okay, and that's all of homework 1.